8 weeks changed me. If you have ever opened an English learning video, listened for 10 seconds, then quietly closed it, not because it was hard, but because you felt tired. Inside, this story is for you. I know that feeling well. And what surprised me most is that I felt it not in my home country, but right here in the United States, during the past 8 weeks. When I thought I was already okay, already used to it, already good enough at English, I wasn't. Those 8 weeks slowly peeled away my old beliefs about money, love, equality, and the kind of English no textbook ever teaches you. When I first arrived in the US, I carried a very familiar belief from my culture: if two people care about each other, money should not be divided too clearly. I believed love showed itself through actions: I'll take care of this, or let me pay this time. I also believed that if my English was not perfect, people would naturally slow down, help me, and understand. And finally, I believed that if I worked hard enough, everything would eventually fall into place. Reality was quieter, but sharper. The first week felt smooth. I listened to English every day. I didn't understand everything, but I nodded a lot. You know the kind of nodding that says, yes, yes, I'm following, even when you're not. I told myself, it's okay. I will get better. But underneath that calm surface, something felt off. It wasn't a loud culture shock. It was more like walking half a step out of rhythm with everyone else, and being the only one who noticed. Then came the second week. It was just a simple dinner. Nothing fancy. No tension. We talked about work, the weather, daily life. When the server brought the check, I instinctively reached for it. An old habit. Without hesitation, the person across from me smiled and said, very casually, we can split the bill. No anger. No coldness. Just a normal sentence. But inside my head, it echoed loudly. Split the bill. I smiled back and said, yes, sure. Out loud, I was calm. Inside, my thoughts were tangled. It wasn't about the money. It was about the feeling that I had done something wrong without knowing what that something was. On the way home, I stayed quiet, not because I was upset, but because my mind was working overtime, trying to understand what had just happened. That was the moment I realized something important. Learning English is not just about words or pronunciation. It's about learning how people think. And that part is much harder. In the days that followed, I started paying closer attention. Americans don't split bills because they are cold or selfish. They split bills because it's normal to them. For many people here, clarity is a form of respect, independence, fairness, responsibility. These words are not just spoken, they live in small daily actions. By the third week, I felt tired. Not physically tired, mentally tired. Tired of translating everything in my head. Translating language. Translating emotions. Translating things no one says directly. I began to doubt myself. Was I too sensitive? Or was I forcing my old values onto a new environment? Some nights, I opened English listening videos, but my ears were listening while my mind replayed conversations, bills, and moments I half Understood. I heard people talk about equality, but what I felt was distance. I started asking myself quietly, does equality really build respect? Or is it just a polite mask for emotional distance? By the fourth week, something shifted. I stopped trying so hard to understand correctly, and instead started observing patiently. I slowed down. I listened more, to words, to pauses, to tone. When people said, let's be clear, I realized it wasn't to push me away. It was to avoid misunderstandings later. My English didn't suddenly improve. I still spoke slowly. Still simple. Still searching for words. But I began using English in real moments, talking about money, boundaries, and feelings, even if all I could manage were short sentences. Weeks 5, 6, and 7 brought quiet changes. I wasn't trying to become American. I was trying to understand them and myself better. I realized that splitting the bill is not about splitting love. It's about standing on equal ground. No one owes. No one feels smaller. By the 8th week, I looked back. 8 weeks is not a long time. But it was long enough for me to see that what hurt me at first was not the act of splitting the bill. It was my unspoken expectations, carried from another culture, never checked, never adjusted. If you are learning English and feel lost, believe me, you are not weak. You are learning something deeper than language. You are learning how to live inside a different value system. And that takes time. So maybe the real question isn't, why do Americans split bills? The real question is this: when everything is placed on equality, are you brave enough to relearn what respect really means, from the beginning? The first climate shock. No one warned me that the weather would mess with my emotions before my English ever did. I thought climate was just background noise, hot or cold, rain or sun. Something you complain about politely and move on. But during my second week in the US, I learned that climate is not just something you feel on your skin. It quietly changes how you think, how you speak, and how patient you are with yourself when learning a new language. Back home, weather felt predictable. Seasons followed rules. Even discomfort had a rhythm. In the US, especially where I was living, the climate felt undecided. One morning was bright and cold, the afternoon suddenly warm, the evening windy again. It sounds small, but when your body can't relax into a pattern, your mind doesn't either. That week, I noticed something strange. On colder mornings, my English felt slower. Not worse, just heavier. Words came out carefully, like they needed permission. On sunny afternoons, I felt lighter, more willing to speak, more tolerant of my mistakes. At first, I blamed myself. Why am I so inconsistent? But then I realized, my environment was quietly shaping my confidence. There's a psychological concept called cognitive load. Simply put, your brain has limited energy. When part of that energy is spent adjusting to cold air, bright light, or sudden temperature changes, there's less left for things like listening in a second language. I didn't know the term back then, but I felt the effect clearly. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe trying to practice listening. The heater was too strong. My body felt tense, my shoulders slightly raised without me noticing. The English I heard sounded faster than usual, even though it probably wasn't. I kept rewinding the same sentence. Not because it was complex, but because my brain was tired before the learning even began. That's when it hit me, maybe my problem wasn't discipline. Maybe it was adaptation. Americans rarely talk about this directly, but they adapt to climate early in life. Their homes, clothes, schedules, even small talk reflect it. It's cold today isn't just weather commentary. It's a shared adjustment ritual. A way of saying, we're all dealing with this together. For someone new, that adjustment takes energy. And energy matters when you're learning English through real life, not through controlled classroom exercises. During that second week, I also noticed how climate influenced social behavior. On colder days, conversations felt shorter. People still smiled, still polite, but interactions moved faster. On warmer days, people lingered. They talked more. They explained things with slightly more patience. The same English, but a different emotional temperature. This mattered to me more than I expected. Because when you're learning English through daily life, you don't just learn words, you borrow emotional cues. You copy tone. You mirror timing. Climate quietly shapes all of that. One evening, after a long walk in cold wind, I came home and tried to reflect on my day in English. Simple sentences. Today was cold. I felt tired. People spoke fast. That was all I could manage. And you know what? That was enough. I stopped judging myself for not being poetic, not being fluent. I realized something important. Clarity comes before complexity. There's research showing that physical comfort improves language retention. When your body feels safe and regulated, your brain learns better. Again, I didn't know the research at the time, but my experience matched it perfectly. On days when I dressed right, warmed up properly, and didn't rush myself, my listening improved. Not dramatically. Quietly. Naturally. That week, I made one small change. Before practicing English, I checked my physical state. Was I cold? Hungry? Overstimulated? If the answer was yes, I fixed that first. Not the grammar. Not the vocabulary. The body. And something softened. I stopped forcing long practice sessions. Instead, I listened in short moments, 10 minutes while walking, 5 minutes while waiting, a simple conversation without pressure to perform. I let the environment teach me instead of fighting it. Climate also taught me something deeper. About American culture. Adaptation is expected here. Not complained about endlessly. If it's cold, you dress differently. If it's hot, you adjust your schedule. That mindset extends beyond weather. It applies to money, relationships, communication. You adjust first, analyze later. Coming from a culture where endurance is praised, this felt unfamiliar. But it was freeing. By the end of the second week, my English hadn't improved dramatically. But my resistance had decreased. I wasn't fighting the weather. I wasn't fighting myself. I was observing. Adjusting. Learning slowly, in context. And maybe that's why climate mattered so much. It taught me the first real lesson of this journey. Before you ask yourself to speak better English, ask yourself if your body feels okay where it is. Because language doesn't live only in your mouth. It lives in your nervous system. If you're learning English and feel strangely tired for no clear reason, look around you. Not at your notebook. Not at your screen. At your environment. Sometimes the first step forward isn't another word, it's a warmer jacket, a slower walk, and permission to adapt. Culture hits quietly. Culture rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock on the door and say, "Welcome, this is how we do things here." Instead, it slips into your day through small moments. How long people pause before answering. How directly they say no. How comfortable they are with silence. During my third week in the US, I realized that culture shock is not loud. It's quiet. And because it's quiet, it's easy to miss, until it starts shaping how you feel about yourself. At that point, my English was still slow but functional. I could order food, join basic conversations, and understand the general idea of what people were saying. On the surface, I was doing fine. But underneath, something subtle was happening. I began feeling slightly off balance in conversations, like I was always arriving half a second too late. In my culture, conversations flow softly. People leave space. They read between the lines. Meaning often lives in what is not said. In the US, especially in everyday interactions, people value clarity over subtlety. They say what they mean, even if it sounds plain. At first, I thought this was refreshing. Then, slowly, it started to feel uncomfortable. Someone would say, "I'm busy." Full stop. No apology. No explanation. My brain immediately searched for hidden meaning. Are they upset? Did I say something wrong? Most of the time, the answer was no. They were simply busy. That realization took energy. There's a concept in psychology called ambiguity tolerance, the ability to sit with uncertainty without stress. I thought I had a high tolerance. But living in a culture where things are said directly forced me to confront a different challenge. Letting go of overinterpretation. During that third week, I noticed how much mental effort I spent guessing intentions instead of listening to words. And when you're learning English, that extra guessing drains your focus. You're not just decoding language, you're decoding culture at the same time. One afternoon, I had a short conversation that stayed with me. I asked someone a question, expecting a soft response. They answered quickly, clearly, and moved on. The conversation ended. No awkwardness. No emotional aftertaste. But I stood there, replaying it in my head, wondering if I had been dismissed. Later that day, I realized something simple and uncomfortable. The discomfort was mine, not theirs. American culture, I was learning, often separates intention from emotion. Saying no does not mean rejection. Ending a conversation does not mean disrespect. It means efficiency. And efficiency is not a lack of care. It's a different way of organizing care. This mattered deeply for my English practice. Because every time I misread a cultural signal, I blamed my language skills. I told myself, if my English were better, I would understand this. But the truth was, my English was fine. My cultural expectations were outdated for this environment. Once I saw that, something loosened inside me. I stopped trying to add emotional weight to every sentence I heard. I listened for what was actually said, not what I expected to be implied. And suddenly, English felt lighter. Not easier, but cleaner. That week, I started practicing a new habit. After conversations, instead of replaying them emotionally, I replayed them linguistically. What words were used? What tone? What was clear? What was direct? This small shift turned everyday interactions into real English practice. Without pressure. I also noticed how this cultural clarity connected to the idea of splitting bills. Direct communication and financial clarity come from the same place. Say what you mean. Pay your share. Avoid silent expectations. It wasn't cold, it was consistent. There's research showing that clear communication reduces cognitive stress. When expectations are explicit, the brain relaxes. I felt that firsthand. Once I stopped searching for hidden messages, my listening improved. My responses became shorter, but more confident. I didn't suddenly become outspoken. I didn't change my personality. But I adjusted my listening. I learned that in this culture, respect often looks like simplicity. One evening, I caught myself saying a sentence I would have avoided before. I don't understand. Can you say that again? Simple. Direct. Honest. And instead of judgment, I received clarity. A repeated explanation. No drama. That moment mattered more than any vocabulary list. Culture didn't hit me like a wave. It arrived like a slow shift in posture. And once I adjusted, my English stopped feeling like a performance. It started feeling like a tool. If you're learning English and feel confused even when you understand the words, ask yourself this. Are you listening for language, or for meaning shaped by another culture? Sometimes progress doesn't come from speaking more. It comes from letting words be exactly what they are. And when you do that, something unexpected happens. You don't just understand English better, you understand yourself more clearly, too. Culture hidden in meals. You wouldn't expect a plate of food to teach you about culture, money, and respect. I didn't either. I thought meals were just breaks in the day, something to enjoy, something familiar. But during my 4th week in the US, I realized that meals are not just about eating. They are quiet lessons. And if you pay attention, they tell you everything about how a society thinks. Back home, meals were emotional spaces. Someone ordered more food than they needed. Someone insisted on paying. Someone pretended not to care about money while caring very much. The table was a place where relationships were negotiated gently, often without words. Who paid, who offered, who insisted, these were not financial actions. They were emotional signals. In the US, the first thing that surprised me was how calm meals felt. Not cold. Just neutral. People ordered what they wanted, ate comfortably, talked freely, and when the bill arrived, no one rushed. No performance. No silent competition. Just a simple question, separate or together? At first, that question made me tense. It felt too direct, too exposed. My mind searched for subtext. What does choosing separate say about us? But I began to notice something important. For Americans, that question wasn't emotional. It was practical. And practicality, I was learning, is not the opposite of care. During that week, I paid attention to how people behaved around food. No one overordered to appear generous. No one underordered to appear polite. People respected their own preferences and expected others to do the same. That respect extended naturally to money. There's a sociological idea that shared rituals reveal shared values. Meals are one of the strongest rituals we have. In American meals, the value that kept showing up was autonomy. You choose. You pay. You enjoy. No hidden debts. That idea quietly challenged me. Because in my culture, care often means anticipating needs without asking. In the US, care often means allowing people to choose without pressure. The difference is subtle, but powerful. One evening, I went out to eat. Again. This time, when the server asked, together or separate? I didn't freeze. I didn't overthink. I simply answered. And something surprising happened. I felt lighter. Not because the bill was split, but because my expectations were finally aligned with the environment. This alignment mattered for my English learning, too. When meals stopped being emotionally loaded, conversations flowed more easily. I wasn't busy managing unspoken rules. I was present. I listened better. I spoke more naturally. My English didn't sound more advanced, but it sounded more real. There's research in cognitive psychology showing that reducing social anxiety improves language performance. Anxiety narrows attention. Ease widens it. I didn't read that research then, but I felt it every time a meal ended without tension. Food also taught me how Americans use conversation. Topics moved lightly. People didn't dig for emotional depth unless invited. This wasn't superficiality, it was respect for boundaries. Emotional intimacy, I learned, is built over time, not demanded at the table. That lesson connected directly to the question of splitting bills. Sharing a meal didn't mean sharing financial responsibility by default. It meant sharing time, sharing space. And that distinction changed how I viewed relationships here. In one quiet moment, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been measuring closeness using old rules. And when those rules didn't apply, I felt rejected, even when I wasn't. Once I saw that, I stopped attaching meaning where none was intended. My English practice improved again, not through effort, but through release. I stopped translating emotions before translating words. I let sentences land as they were. That week, I also noticed how children behaved at tables. They ordered for themselves. They paid attention to their choices. Independence was taught early, not through lectures, but through repetition. Small moments. repeated often, become values. Meals, it turns out, were classrooms. By the end of the 4th week, I no longer felt nervous when the bill arrived. I saw it for what it was, an administrative step, not an emotional verdict. And with that clarity, respect felt easier to build, not forced, not performative. If you're learning English and feel tense in social situations, especially around food or money, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, am I reacting to language or to expectations from another culture? Sometimes the biggest lessons come when you're holding a fork, not a textbook. And sometimes, understanding a culture starts with realizing that a meal doesn't need to carry the weight of your feelings. It just needs to be shared, clearly, calmly, and honestly. English outside the classroom. By the 5th week, something became very clear to me. If I waited until my English felt good enough to use in real life, I would wait forever. Up until that point, I had treated English like a subject, something to practice privately, safely, where mistakes didn't feel expensive. But real life in the US didn't care about my readiness. It kept happening. Conversations happened in lines, in cars, at tables, in moments you couldn't pause or rewind. And that's where my real English learning finally began. In classrooms or videos, English feels controlled. Sentences are complete. Accents are polite. Mistakes are expected. Outside the classroom, English is messy. People interrupt themselves. They change direction mid-sentence. They speak while walking, eating, thinking about something else. At first, this chaos made me feel slow. Not stupid, just constantly one step behind. But that slowness taught me something important. One morning, I stood in line at a coffee shop, rehearsing my order in my head. Simple words. Nothing fancy. When it was my turn, the barista asked a follow-up question I didn't expect. My rehearsed sentence collapsed. I froze for half a second, then answered with the only thing that came out naturally. It wasn't grammatically perfect, but it was honest. And it worked. That moment stayed with me. Not because I spoke well, but because I communicated. Outside the classroom, no one is grading you. People are not listening for your grammar. They are listening for your intention. That realization slowly removed a heavy layer of fear from my English practice. There's a concept in language learning called communicative competence, the ability to get your message across, even with limited language. I didn't know the term back then, but I was living it. I learned that short, clear sentences often work better than long, perfect ones. Can you say that again? I don't understand yet. I need a moment. These sentences became my tools. Not advanced, but powerful. By the 5th week, I also noticed how English changes depending on context. The English people used with friends sounded different from the English used at work. The English at home felt softer. The English around money felt more precise. And that precision mattered when talking about things like splitting bills. When people discussed money, they didn't soften the language. They clarified it. Numbers. Timing. Responsibility. At first, that directness made me uncomfortable. But I began to appreciate it. Clear language reduced confusion. Confusion, I learned, creates emotional tension. This mattered in my relationships, too. When I avoided English, I avoided small misunderstandings. When I used English, even imperfectly, I allowed clarity to enter. Saying, "I feel unsure about this," was better than staying silent and guessing. Silence, I realized, often feels polite, but it creates invisible distance. There's research showing that active language use strengthens memory far more than passive listening. Again, I didn't read the studies during that time, but my experience matched them. The more I spoke in real situations, the less afraid I felt. Not because I improved quickly, but because fear stopped controlling me. One evening, I caught myself laughing during a conversation, even though I hadn't understood every word. That was new. Laughter used to come after understanding. Now it came with connection. That shift told me I was finally participating, not just observing. English outside the classroom also taught me humility. I had to accept sounding basic, childlike, sometimes. And that acceptance opened doors. People slowed down, not because they felt sorry for me, but because I was honest about my level. By the end of the 5th week, English no longer felt like a test. It felt like a bridge. Sometimes shaky. Sometimes narrow. But usable. And maybe that's the most important lesson. Fluency doesn't begin with confidence. Confidence begins with permission, to be imperfect, to be slow. To be real. If you're learning English and waiting for the day you feel ready, let me tell you gently, that day doesn't arrive first. It follows. Real English is not built in quiet rooms. It's built in imperfect moments, when you speak anyway, and discover that being understood matters more than being correct. Love tested by money. By the 6th week, I realized that money doesn't test a relationship loudly. It tests it quietly, in moments that seem too small to matter, until they start adding up. I had always believed that love was proven through care, sacrifice, and emotional presence. Money, in my mind, was secondary. Practical. Necessary, yes, but not central. Living in the US challenged that belief in ways I didn't expect. At first, everything felt balanced. We laughed easily. Conversations flowed better than before. My English was still simple, but it no longer stood between us. I believed that once language barriers softened, emotional closeness would naturally grow. What I didn't realize was that money had its own language, and I was still learning how to hear it. In my culture, paying more is often a quiet way of saying I care. You don't announce it. You just do it. And the other person understands. In the US, I learned, care is often expressed through fairness, not sacrifice. That difference sounds small. But emotionally, it's huge. One evening, we planned a simple activity. Nothing special. When the cost came up, the conversation was calm and clear. We each paid our part. No discussion. No hesitation. I smiled, agreed, and moved on. But later that night, I felt something tighten inside me, not anger, not sadness, just confusion. If everything is always equal, where does generosity live? I didn't say this out loud. I didn't have the words. In any language. That silence was the real problem. Psychologists often say that unspoken expectations create emotional debt. I felt that debt growing, even though no one owed anything financially. I realized I was measuring love using rules that were invisible to the other person. And when those rules weren't followed, I felt disappointed without knowing why. This is where English mattered more than grammar ever could. Because love across cultures requires translation, not just of words, but of values. I needed to explain how I understood care. And I needed to understand how care was being expressed toward me. But explaining emotions in a second language feels risky. You worry about sounding dramatic, or childish, or unclear. So instead of speaking, I stayed quiet. And quiet, I learned, can feel safe, but it can also create distance. During that week, I noticed how Americans talk about money in relationships. Not emotionally. Structurally. What feels fair? What works for you? These questions are not romantic. But they are respectful. They assume two adults meeting as equals, not one person proving love through sacrifice. That idea challenged me deeply. One night, after a long pause, I finally said a simple sentence. Sometimes I feel confused about money and feelings. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't complete. But it was honest. And instead of conflict, I received clarity. We talked. Slowly. Calmly. Not to win, but to understand. That conversation changed something important. I realized that splitting bills wasn't a lack of love. It was an invitation to talk openly, to remove assumptions, and replace them with agreements. Love, in this context, wasn't about guessing. It was about choosing clarity over comfort. There's research showing that couples who discuss finances openly report higher relationship satisfaction. Again, I didn't know the studies then. I just felt the relief of naming something that had been sitting quietly between us. My English didn't suddenly improve that night. But my courage did. By the end of the 6th week, I saw money differently. Not as a test of affection, but as a mirror. It reflects how each person understands respect, independence, and partnership. When those reflections don't match, tension appears. Not because someone is wrong, but because something hasn't been translated yet. If you're learning English and navigating relationships in a new culture, know this. The hardest conversations are not about vocabulary. They're about values. And those conversations don't require perfect English. They require honesty, patience, and the willingness to sound imperfect. Love isn't weakened by equality, but it is weakened by silence. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do, in any language, is to say, I don't fully understand yet. Can we talk about it? Equality, or emotional distance. By the 7th week, the question stopped being about money. It became something quieter and harder to name. I started asking myself, does equality bring people closer, or does it create emotional distance when you don't understand it yet? This question followed me through daily life, through conversations, through moments that looked peaceful on the outside but felt unsettled inside. On the surface, everything seemed fair. Bills were split. Decisions were discussed. No one controlled anyone. No one owed anyone. If you looked only at structure, the relationship was healthy, balanced, modern. But emotions don't always follow structure. Sometimes they lag behind, carrying habits from another world. In my earlier life, closeness often came from imbalance. Someone gave more. Someone insisted. Someone sacrificed quietly. Love was proven through unevenness. When one person paid more, cared more, worried more, it created a sense of emotional weight, and weight felt like meaning. In the US, I was learning that meaning is built differently. Equality is not meant to flatten emotion. It's meant to protect it. But that idea takes time to sink in. That week, I noticed a pattern in my own reactions. When things were too clear, too balanced, I felt strangely unnecessary. If we always split the bill, if decisions were always mutual, where was my role? Where was my chance to show care? My discomfort wasn't about rejection, it was about identity. Psychologists talk about something called role confusion. When familiar roles disappear, people feel lost even in healthy situations. I didn't know the term then, but I felt the effect clearly. Equality removed my old script, and I hadn't written a new one yet. This confusion affected my English, too. When emotions felt uncertain, my speech became cautious. I chose safe words, short answers, neutral tones. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't trust my interpretation of the situation. I was afraid of overreacting in a culture where directness is normal. One afternoon, during a simple conversation, I hesitated before speaking. The pause was long enough to feel awkward. The other person noticed and asked, "Are you okay?" That question landed gently, but it landed. I realized then that equality does not remove emotional responsibility. It increases it. When no one is guessing, you have to speak. When no one is sacrificing silently, you have to express care intentionally. That realization was uncomfortable, but freeing. I started observing American couples more closely. Not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. They didn't prove love through grand gestures. They proved it through consistency, through showing up on time, through clear communication, through respecting boundaries, even when emotions were involved. Emotional closeness here wasn't built by merging lives completely. It was built by choosing connection again and again, from a position of independence. That idea slowly softened my fear. I tried something new. Instead of waiting for situations where I could give more, I started expressing care directly. Simple sentences. I appreciate this. This matters to me. I feel closer when we talk like this. My English was basic, but the intention was clear. And something surprising happened. Closeness didn't decrease. It grew. Equality didn't erase emotion. It gave emotion room to breathe, without obligation, without debt. There's research suggesting that relationships, with clear boundaries often experience deeper trust over time. Again, I didn't read that research during those weeks. I lived it. When expectations were spoken instead of assumed, misunderstandings faded. When fairness was clear, gratitude felt more genuine. By the end of the 7th week, I understood something important. Emotional distance doesn't come from equality. It comes from unspoken needs. When you expect someone to show love in a way they were never taught, distance appears. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know the rules. You're playing by. Learning English in this environment taught me a parallel lesson. If I waited for people to guess my meaning, I stayed silent. If I spoke simply and clearly, connection happened, even with imperfect grammar. Equality asks for courage. The courage to speak instead of hint. To ask instead of expect. To trust that respect doesn't need imbalance to exist. If you're learning English and living in a culture that values equality, you might feel this tension too. You might wonder why things feel calm, but emotionally unfamiliar. That doesn't mean something is wrong. It means you're in the space between old meaning and new understanding. And that space is not distance. It's transition. Sometimes, respect grows not from how much you give, but from how clearly you stand beside someone, as an equal, and say, this is who I am. This is what I feel. Can we meet here? Marriage reality in America. By the 8th week, I stopped thinking about money as a personal issue, and started seeing it as a system. And marriage, especially in America, exists inside that system whether you want it to or not. Before coming here, I believed marriage was mostly about emotional commitment. Love, patience, sacrifice. The rest, I assumed, would naturally work itself out. Living in the US quietly challenged that belief. In American culture, marriage is deeply connected to structure. Legal structure. Financial structure. Communication structure. None of this feels romantic at first. But over time, I realized it serves a purpose. It protects clarity. Back home, many couples rely on emotional understanding. Roles are often assumed rather than discussed. Who pays? Who decides? Who sacrifices more? These questions are answered through habit, not conversation. In the US, I noticed something different. Couples talk about these things early. Sometimes awkwardly. Sometimes bluntly. But they talk. That openness shocked me at first. During my 8th week, I heard married couples discuss money with a calm I wasn't used to. They talked about shared expenses, personal accounts, responsibilities. Not as conflict, but as maintenance. Like checking the oil in a car. Necessary, not emotional. I realized that American marriage treats equality not as a threat to love, but as a foundation for it. That idea forced me to look at my own assumptions. I had believed that if two people truly cared, they wouldn't need to talk about money too much. They would feel their way through. But feelings change. Systems last. Psychologists call this externalizing responsibility, putting decisions into agreed structures so emotions don't carry all the weight. Again, I didn't know the term then. I only felt the relief of knowing where things stood. This clarity affected my English learning in a surprising way. When conversations had structure, my language felt safer. I knew the topic. I knew the goal. I didn't have to guess what was expected emotionally. Talking about money, plans, or responsibilities used clear words. Simple verbs. Direct questions. My English didn't need to be poetic, it needed to be accurate. And accuracy builds confidence. One evening, I listened to a married couple discuss a financial decision. There was no tension. No drama. Just exchange. I realized that respect in this context didn't come from emotional intensity. It came from predictability. From knowing that both people were accountable. That changed how I viewed splitting bills within marriage. It wasn't about distance. It was about dignity. Each person retained a sense of agency. No one felt dependent. And when help was given, it felt chosen, not expected. That idea was difficult for me at first. I came from a background where merging completely was seen as love. But complete merging can also hide imbalance. In the American model I observed, equality didn't erase closeness, it prevented resentment. There's research showing that couples with clear financial agreements experience fewer long-term conflicts. Again, I didn't read it during those weeks. I felt it in the calm conversations I witnessed. By the end of the 8th week, I saw marriage differently. Not as a constant emotional negotiation, but as a partnership supported by clear agreements. Love still mattered deeply, but it didn't have to carry everything alone. For someone learning English, this environment offered a strange comfort. I didn't need emotional fluency. I needed functional clarity. Simple sentences. Clear meaning. Respectful tone. Marriage in America taught me that equality is not about keeping score. It's about creating a space where both people can stand firmly, without leaning too heavily on the other. If you're learning English and navigating relationships in a new culture, this lesson matters. You don't need to understand everything emotionally right away. Sometimes understanding the structure is enough to keep moving forward. Love grows inside systems, whether we admit it or not. And when the system is clear, the heart doesn't have to work so hard to feel safe. Family and children. By the 9th week, my attention shifted from couples and conversations to something quieter, but even more revealing, family life. Not the big family moments you see in movies, but the ordinary ones, breakfast routines, short conversations, children asking simple questions. Watching families in the US taught me more about language, values, and respect than any formal lesson ever could. Children here speak English with confidence long before they speak it perfectly. They ask questions freely. They interrupt adults without fear. They express opinions early. At first, this surprised me. In my culture, children are often taught to listen more than they speak. Respect is shown through silence and obedience. In the US, respect looks different. It looks like participation. That difference matters when you're learning English. I noticed that American parents often explain their decisions, even to young children. Because I said so exists. But it's not the default. Explanations are short, practical, and repeated often. Language becomes a daily tool, not a performance. This constant, low-pressure exposure creates confidence. Not perfection, confidence. One afternoon, I heard a child ask a parent why they couldn't buy something. The parent didn't avoid the topic. They explained cost, choice, and responsibility in simple terms. Money wasn't hidden. It wasn't emotional. It was educational. That moment stayed with me. It connected directly to the idea of splitting bills. Financial transparency wasn't introduced suddenly in adulthood, it was built slowly from childhood. Children learned early that choices have costs, and fairness matters. This shaped how families communicated. I also noticed how family conversations happened in short bursts. Not long lectures. Not dramatic speeches. Just simple exchanges repeated over time. This repetition created understanding. And it reminded me that learning English doesn't require long study sessions, it requires consistent, real interaction. There's research showing that language acquisition improves dramatically when learners feel safe to make mistakes. Children embody this perfectly. They try. They fail. They try again. No shame. Watching them made me question why adults are so hard on themselves. I realized that my fear of speaking English came from self-judgment, not lack of ability. Family life in the US also showed me how independence is taught early. Children are encouraged to choose, to decide, to speak up. That independence is paired with responsibility. You choose, you explain, you accept outcomes. That logic continues into adulthood, into relationships, into finances. Suddenly, the cultural puzzle made sense. Splitting bills isn't a cold adult habit. It's the adult version of a childhood lesson. Be responsible for your choices, and respect others' choices too. That realization softened something in me. I stopped seeing fairness as emotional distance. I started seeing it as a form of care that prepares people to stand on their own, together. This perspective changed how I practiced English. Instead of aiming for fluency, I aimed for clarity. Like a child explaining something simply. I allowed myself to ask basic questions. I repeated phrases. I focused on being understood, not sounding impressive. My confidence grew quietly. By observing families, I also saw how respect flows both ways. Parents listen to children. Children learn to explain themselves. This mutual respect creates a safe space for language. And safety, I learned, is the real foundation of learning. By the end of the 9th week, I understood something deeply. Culture isn't taught through rules. It's taught through daily habits. And those habits shape how people speak, love, and share responsibility. If you're learning English and feeling behind, watch how children speak. Not to copy their vocabulary, but to copy their courage. They don't wait until they are ready. They speak because they are curious. And curiosity, more than perfection, is what carries language and relationships forward. The week I almost quit. The 10th week was the hardest. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No big arguments. No emotional explosions. Just a quiet weight that settled in slowly and made everything feel heavy. It was the week I almost quit, not just learning English, but trying to understand this culture, this system. This version of myself. By that time, I had already accepted many things intellectually. I understood why Americans split bills. I understood the value of equality and structure. I even appreciated the clarity it brought to relationships. But understanding something in your mind doesn't mean your heart immediately follows. That week, my energy dropped. Simple conversations felt tiring. My English didn't disappear, but my motivation did. I caught myself avoiding small talk, choosing silence instead of effort. I thought, what's the point? I could survive without fully understanding everything. Many immigrants do. This is a moment many learners don't talk about. People often imagine language learning as a steady climb. But in reality, it's emotional. Some weeks you grow. Some weeks you stall. And some weeks, you want to walk away. For me, the pressure came from comparison. I saw people speaking effortlessly. Couples communicating clearly. Children explaining their thoughts with confidence. And I felt behind. Not linguistically, but emotionally. I questioned whether I was changing too much, or not enough. That doubt spilled into my relationship. We had a small disagreement about money. Nothing serious. But it triggered something deeper. I felt tired of explaining myself. Tired of translating my thoughts into another language. Tired of negotiating meaning, tone, intention. In that moment, equality felt exhausting. I wondered if it would be easier to return to familiar patterns. Let one person decide. Let one person pay. Let emotions fill the gaps where words failed. But that comfort came with a cost. That evening, I went for a long walk alone. No phone. No music. Just my thoughts in mixed languages. I realized something important. I wasn't tired of English. I was tired of uncertainty. Back home, many things were assumed. Here, everything had to be expressed. An expression requires energy. There's a concept in psychology called decision fatigue. When you have to consciously decide and articulate everything, you get tired faster. That's what I was experiencing, not cultural rejection, but cognitive overload. Understanding this changed everything. I stopped blaming myself. Instead of quitting, I simplified. That week, I made a quiet decision. I would stop trying to be deep. I would aim to be clear. Short sentences. Honest words. No performance. No pressure to sound fluent or emotional. Something shifted. The next conversation felt lighter. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. I said less, but meant more. And I noticed something surprising. People responded with patience. Respect returned, not because I tried harder, but because I showed up honestly. This applied to money too. I stopped seeing financial discussions as emotional tests. I treated them as shared problem solving. When emotions came up, I named them simply. I feel tired. I feel unsure. These weren't advanced English sentences, but they were enough. That week taught me that quitting often feels tempting right before integration happens. Language learning, and cultural learning, has a breaking point where resistance turns into acceptance. Not dramatic acceptance. Quiet acceptance. The kind that doesn't announce itself. By the end of that week, I didn't feel excited. I felt stable. And stability is underrated. For anyone practicing real English through real life, this matters. You don't need constant motivation. You need permission to slow down. To rest without quitting. Equality doesn't mean everything is easy. It means both people carry their share, even when one is tired. That week almost broke me. But instead, it refined me. I learned that progress doesn't always look like moving forward. Sometimes, it looks like staying. When respect became quiet. By the 11th week, something strange happened. The noise inside me softened. Not disappeared, but lowered, like a radio finally tuned to the right frequency. Nothing magical changed on the outside. Bills were still split. English was still imperfect. Life in the US was still structured, efficient, and sometimes emotionally distant. But respect, real respect, had started to appear quietly. And that's the thing about respect in American culture. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't come wrapped in emotional reassurance. It shows up as consistency. That week, I noticed small things. Conversations ended without tension. Decisions were made faster. Disagreements didn't spiral into misunderstandings. It felt almost boring. And yet, safe. At first, I didn't trust it. Back where I came from, love and respect were loud. They showed up in sacrifice, emotional intensity, and sometimes even conflict. Silence often meant distance. Calm meant something was wrong. But here, calm meant alignment. I realized I had been measuring respect using the wrong ruler. In the US, respect often looks like space. Like letting the other person choose. Like not interfering unless asked. Like trusting adults to manage their own emotions. This cultural difference affected how I practiced English too. Earlier, I tried to sound polite by being indirect. I softened everything. I added extra explanations. I apologized too much. But Americans often interpret that as uncertainty, not kindness. That week, I experimented with something new, clarity without apology. Not rudeness. Just clarity. I don't agree. I need time. I'm not comfortable with that yet. Simple sentences. Calm tone. No emotional defense. And the response shocked me. People didn't push back. They didn't feel offended. They adjusted. This is where equality builds respect, not through emotional merging, but through clear boundaries. In relationships, especially romantic ones, this was a turning point. We talked about money again, not as a problem, but as a system. Who pays for what? Why? When flexibility makes sense. When it doesn't. No guilt. No hidden expectations. Splitting bills stopped being symbolic. It became practical. And with practicality came peace. There's research in relationship psychology showing that predictability reduces conflict more than affection does. When both people know what to expect, emotional energy is freed up for connection instead of negotiation. That's what I felt. My English practice became more natural too. I stopped chasing perfect sentences and started using functional language. Real English. The kind people actually use when they're tired, busy, or emotionally neutral. I see. That works for me. Let's decide later. These phrases don't appear in textbooks as emotional breakthroughs, but they are. Because language is not just about expression. It's about regulation. That week, I felt regulated. I also noticed something else. Respect grew when I respected myself. When I stopped over-explaining. When I stopped seeking validation through language. When I accepted that my accent, pauses, and simplicity were part of my identity, not obstacles. In American culture, confidence is often associated with calmness. Not loud confidence. Quiet certainty. I wasn't fluent. But I was steady. And steadiness earned trust. In public spaces, at stores, in conversations with neighbors, I felt less invisible. Not because I spoke more, but because I spoke when it mattered. This is an important lesson for anyone learning English through real-life stories. You don't need emotional intensity to be understood. You need alignment between words and intention. That alignment takes time. By week 11, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not my love. Not my effort. Not my progress. And paradoxically, that's when respect deepened. Equality didn't erase warmth. It filtered it. Instead of dramatic gestures, care showed up as reliability. Showing up on time. Paying your share. Following through. Listening without fixing. These behaviors don't feel romantic at first, but they build something stronger than romance. They build trust. And trust is the quiet language everyone understands, even without perfect English. As I reflected on my journey, I realized something powerful. Splitting bills wasn't about money at all. It was about responsibility. About adulthood. About seeing each other as equals, not saviors or dependents. That realization changed how I saw myself. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was a participant. In the language. In the culture. In the relationship. Respect didn't arrive with applause. It settled in quietly, like a habit you don't notice until it's gone. And by the end of that week, I didn't feel like I was surviving American life. I felt like I belonged to it, on my own terms. What 8 weeks really changed? By the 12th week, I stopped counting weeks. Not because time stopped mattering, but because the journey no longer felt temporary. What began as an 8-week experiment in the US had quietly turned into a shift in how I saw relationships, language, and myself. Nothing dramatic happened at the end. No final test. No emotional speech. Just clarity. And clarity, I learned, is the real ending. When people ask me now, why do Americans split bills? I don't answer with culture or money anymore. I answer with responsibility. With boundaries. With the belief that respect grows when no one is silently carrying more than they agreed to. At the beginning of these 8 weeks, splitting bills felt cold. It felt like distance, disguised as fairness. I worried it would erase romance, tenderness, or care. But what I didn't understand then was this: romance that depends on imbalance is fragile. Equality didn't weaken connection. It stabilized it. By week 12, money had become boring, and that was the point. It no longer carried emotional weight. It didn't symbolize love or rejection. It was just a shared detail in a much bigger picture. And that bigger picture was trust. Trust in communication. Trust in intentions. Trust that both people were adults choosing each other, not depending on each other to fill emotional gaps. My English reflected this change. I no longer tried to impress. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I spoke slower. I paused without panic. I used simple words with confidence. Real English isn't fast. It's accurate. I understand. I don't agree. I appreciate that. I need help. These sentences don't sound poetic, but they build real life. One of the biggest lessons I learned is that language doesn't create respect. Behavior does. Language only reveals it. When I paid my share, showed up consistently, and communicated clearly, my imperfect English didn't matter. People listened. They adjusted. They respected me. This applies to marriage too. Love in the US, at least in my experience, is not about sacrifice without limit. It's about partnership with structure. You don't prove love by giving more. You prove it by staying balanced, so resentment doesn't grow quietly in the background. That idea changed how I saw commitment. Back home, endurance was praised. Here, sustainability is valued. A relationship is successful not because it survives pain, but because it prevents unnecessary pain through systems, agreements, and honesty. Splitting bills is one of those systems. It removes assumptions. It removes power imbalance. It invites conversation instead of expectation. And conversation is where language learning truly lives. Over these weeks, my English improved not because I studied harder, but because I needed it. I needed it to explain feelings calmly, to negotiate fairly, to express limits without guilt. That's real practice. If you're learning English through stories like this, here's what I want you to know: you don't need dramatic confidence. You need functional courage. The courage to speak even when sentences are simple. The courage to ask instead of assume. The courage to say, "This is new for me," without apology. Cultural shock isn't failure. It's feedback. Every moment of discomfort taught me something about myself. About what I expected. About what I feared losing. About what I was ready to rebuild differently. By the end of week 12, I didn't feel like I had mastered American culture. I felt like I had made peace with not needing to. Belonging doesn't require perfection. It requires participation. I participate now, with my accent, my pauses, my evolving understanding. I participate as an equal partner, not a silent observer. And that's the quiet gift these 8 weeks gave me. Equality didn't make love colder. It made it clearer. Respect didn't arrive through sacrifice. It arrived through balance. English didn't become fluent overnight. It became usable. Honest. Real. If there's one sentence I carry with me now, it's this: you don't need to disappear to belong. You just need to show up fully. That's what splitting bills taught me. That's what equality built. And that's what real-life English sounds like: imperfect, steady, and deeply human. If you've made it this far, then this story wasn't just mine anymore. It touched something inside you too. Maybe you came here to practice English. Maybe you were curious why Americans split bills. Or maybe, without realizing it, you were looking for proof that learning a language, surviving cultural shock, and protecting love can happen at the same time. This is what I learned after 8 intense weeks in the United States. Equality doesn't kill romance. It kills confusion. Splitting bills isn't about money. It's about responsibility, respect, and seeing each other as adults, standing side by side, not above or below. And English isn't about sounding perfect. It's about being understood when life gets real. If you're struggling with listening, if you're tired of translating your thoughts in your head, if you feel stuck between who you were and who you're becoming, you are not behind. You are in transition. That's why this channel exists. Here, we don't learn English from textbooks. We learn real English through real-life stories about culture, relationships, marriage, money, mistakes, and growth in America. Slow English. Clear English. English you can feel. If this story helped you even a little, like the video so more learners can find it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Save or share this video with someone who's learning English or navigating life abroad. More real stories are coming. More honest English. More moments that sound simple, but change how you think. Because sometimes, the story you need most isn't about English at all. It's about becoming yourself in a new language. Subscribe now and continue the journey with me.